Shalom and welcome to Yeshiva B'nai Noach. I'm Tom Averna. We are going to continue with our series on the B'nai Noach and the Noahide laws. Let's go over to our slideshow from PowerPoint, and we'll get started there with our second class, where we are right now. And just as a reminder, we've given you a look at where we can find hints for the original laws given to man by God. In Genesis, we took a look at several of the verses there where we can find the laws at least inferred. We also looked at the apocryphal story from Jubilees that explained the laws that were given to man by God, but also taught and explained by the angels, according to the book of Jubilees, to select men who then taught them to mankind. After Noah, his son Shem established a school where Abraham and his children learned the laws there. We saw that Moses taught these laws as well as a few new ones, given all prior to the Sinai covenant. Another thing that I want to emphasize is as we look at the big picture in terms of the Noahide laws and all of Torah, as you read the Torah in search of the Noahides as distinct from the Israelites. Now this is something that has been a criticism of the Noahide laws. Well, it's not in the Torah. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Torah. Again, we kind of touched on this in the first class, but remember that the Torah's primary purpose is to present the story not of the world, but of a small group of people who were chosen by God to teach the rest of the world many truths. And we're not going to prove this, but you can look through Torah, you can find many examples where we're told that we are to teach. Okay? The primary covenant discussed in this book, in the Torah, is the Sinai covenant, with brief attention to both the Abrahamic covenant and the Noahide covenant. And these are three covenants that are distinct and separate covenants, although the Abrahamic covenants are included, I should say, in the Sinai covenant. The Abrahamic covenant includes actually 5 main points, a few more probably besides these, but 5 main points that would also be added into the covenant for Abraham's children at Sinai. So we have the blessings, God's promise to bless Abraham and his descendants and all nations through Abraham, the blessing that his descendants would be numerous and that they would become many nations. The blessing of land, God promised to give Abraham and his descendants an eternal inheritance of land. The blessing of circumcision, or the commandment of circumcision, certainly. God commanded Abraham and his descendants to perform circumcision as a symbol of the covenant. And these covenants, according to Torah, are unconditional and everlasting. And I don't need to describe the word everlasting. It means it's going to be eternal. So either you believe the Torah or you don't believe the Torah, but these covenants are all eternal. These, by the way, can be found in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, Genesis 13, 14 through 16, Genesis 15, Genesis 17, Genesis 18, and Genesis 22. So here's the point. The Sinai covenant and its laws were given only to the descendants of Abraham and not to the world. So that's kind of good news for the world. You're not required to keep the 613 plus commandments. Only the children of Abraham, only the Jews are required. The world already had its covenant, so you're not completely off the hook. And its covenant was given to Noah and his descendants. Since these laws were well known, also the ones taught to the world by Abraham, who learned them directly from Noah's son Shem and Shem's son Eber, there was no need to spend any time in the Torah on teaching them. Also, the idea is so prevalent and taught in Christianity that Gentiles can be grafted onto the tree of Abraham. And really, that idea is misunderstood or completely deceptive. So let me explain what I mean. I know that there are some of you that are watching this that may disagree with this, but the idea of grafting, I mean, think about it. What does it mean to be grafted? First of all, grafting an unlike species is strictly forbidden in Judaism. You can't graft two unlike two trees that don't have any connection to each other, or two plants, or two animals, or two humans, or human and animal. Even if you could argue that Jews and Gentiles are all human and therefore not unlike, you still have to understand the purpose of grafting. The grafted limb doesn't change the tree into itself, but the other way around. Understanding this, you recognize that another way to understand this idea of grafting is called conversion or even adoption. In this context, you cannot be grafted into the family of Abraham without then fully accepting upon yourself both covenants pertinent to that family. We'll look more closely at this when we get to the section on Christianity and the Noahides next time. And I know that there are teachings in Christianity that go against this, but it just doesn't make sense. Okay? If you're going to adopt into a family, you're not going to tell that family that all of its ideas before you came into the family were wrong. You have to be a part of that family. Anyway, so I'm not going to spend any more time on that, but I do want to give that information up front as we continue this. So it's important to understand that throughout Israel's history, as recorded in both the Torah and the Tanakh, of course, remember that the Tanakh actually includes the Torah, but it's the Torah, it's the prophets, it's the writings. Those are the three sections that make up the Tanakh. Israel, throughout the Tanakh, is recognized and has recognized that righteous Gentiles were those who followed the Noahide covenant, and these were allowed to live side by side with them in Israel. We're going to look at some of the proofs of this a little later. Any Gentile who didn't want to convert to Judaism could choose to forsake their idolatry and to follow the Noahide covenants and be fully accepted into Israeli society. It's generally believed that these folks were called the Ger Toshav, Ger Toshav, G-E-R-T-O-S-H-A-V, the Ger Toshav, or the God-fearers, as they're also known, okay? And that various parts of Scripture mention them. Also mentioned in Scripture is the Ger Tzaddik, the righteous Ger, and that person, those people are Gentiles who chose to convert to Judaism, as opposed to the Ger Toshav, or the God-fearer that chose to remain Gentile, but wanted to follow the laws of Noah and thereby be allowed into the community of Israel. Now, suffice it to say, in the first century, the Gentile followers of Jesus were taught these Noahide laws. Again, we're going to show that a little later on. And they may have expanded them because of Jesus' teachings, but we'll take a look at that and at proofs for that in the next class. So these God-fearers were identified in Acts as well. We'll take a look at that. And also in the writings of Josephus and Philo. And at the time, according to Josephus and Philo, these God-fearers numbered in the thousands, possibly even the millions. And we see in some of the early churches, and we'll see some examples of this again as we get into this later on. There were references to these God-fearers. But when Constantine, in 300 something, when Constantine took over the Christian church, and this is a very important thing to remember historically, when he took over the Christian church and made it a world religion, his world at any rate, the Roman Empire. He remade the church in his image. We're not going to spend a lot of time going over that. You can look up the history of Constantine and find all of this information out for yourself. But it's very clear that Constantine did not want any connection to the Jewish roots of Christianity. And he made sure that they were eliminated as much as he possibly could when putting his church together. And that included the teachings of the Noahide covenant, although that essentially, I guess, I don't know that it's ironic, but that essentially is what the Christians call the new covenant, is essentially the Noahide covenant. It is the covenant that already existed. It's nothing new. It's a covenant that existed for Gentiles who did not want to convert to Judaism. And that's the whole argument that Paul has and the Jerusalem church has, and again, all of that we'll look at. But just as an overview here, keep that in mind. Since Jews were forbidden to teach Christians on penalty of death, that fact remained hidden throughout the Middle Ages, pretty much up until modern times, as well as the responsibility given to Israel to teach Gentiles these laws. And that's been hidden for many centuries. But in the 13th century, one of the greatest rabbis in our history wrote a compendium of Jewish laws, and in them he included information on the Noahide laws. Now, we'll continue our look at the laws from the writings of Maimonides, Rambam, Rabbi Moses ben Maimar. But I do want to have another disclaimer, and as we look at some of the very harsh decrees given for the Noahide transgressions of the laws, there's two disclaimers essentially. One is that this Maimonides is one opinion, although a very important one. And as we can see from the chart from our list last week, we can see that there are dissenting opinions. Maimonides makes it very clear that Shabbat observance by Gentiles is forbidden. And yet we have in the Talmud and in the writings of Ramah, we have very clearly that they are allowed Shabbat observance. Also, we have a little bit of a conflict regarding Torah study. Ramah seems or rather Talmud actually seems to indicate that Torah studies accepted. Ramah kind of hedges that bet a little bit by saying only studying Torah for the Noahide sections and nothing else. But we'll look at that a little bit. That's not really the scope. But what I mainly want you to see here is that all of these 7 Noahide laws, and remember we connected them to the commandments, the 10 commandments. We connected them in each case with the commandment that's associated with them. And we see that pretty much all of the commandments, with the exception of honoring parents and Shabbat observance, are contained in the main names of each of the laws. And we talked about the fact that these laws are categories, not just specific laws, so that they encompass other things. And we put, again, arbitrarily, this was not necessarily from anything in the Talmud, but we put together a list of what other names for the Noahide laws, since we had over 30 laws that were enumerated. We put them in the categories of the 7, just to show you how that would look. So that's one point. We want to see that all of these things that Maimonides strictly prohibits, there is some discussion or room for discussion about. The second is that there are no penalties given for either Jew or Gentile, especially the death penalty, because we're going to come across that, and that's going to bother you. But there is no death penalty given while there is no Sanhedrin in session and the majority of Jews are not in the land, and the Jubilee is not celebrated there. So in spite of the fact that Torah may call for the death penalty for various things, it doesn't exist right now. And even when it does exist, the last Sanhedrin, by the way, was disbanded about 425 of the Common Era. But even when the Sanhedrin's in session, excuse me, one of the things that Hillel, one of the comments that Rabbi Hillel in the first century made is that any Sanhedrin that puts to death more than, I can't remember the exact number, 1 or 2, is a bloody Sanhedrin. In other words, the death penalty is very seldom actually invoked, and there are all kinds of guards for that. So one last thing before we get started with the reading of the Mishneh Torah. There is a phrase used in several verses, and that phrase is, quote, this, or it could say these, laws do not apply with regards to Jews. This is very confusing. I've not found any commentary in English that explains it, and although I'm sure it exists, I wasn't able to find it. Suffice it to say, it cannot mean that Jews are not forbidden some of these restrictions. They clearly are. The response from Google AI, for whatever that's worth, on the question, as I put it in there, returns the answer that this refers to the fact that Jews are not liable to this Noahide law because they are liable under their own laws. So this makes sense, but no authority is given for that answer, so I don't know. At any rate, be aware that when we read that, know that it cannot mean Jews are exempt from following any of these laws. The only arguable question is regarding the laws of Shabbat and Torah study, as we talked about earlier. We mentioned Rabbi Weiner's book, The Divine Code. Here's a quote from him about Rambam and his book. And it says, Rambam is nearly the only Rishon, that means that refers to rabbinic commentators from the 11th to the 15th century. Rambam is nearly the only Rishon who took responsibility for authoritative teachings in this area. The other well-known classical rabbinical works, such as Torah and Shulchan Aruch, did not provide explicit rulings on Torah law for Gentiles. Instead, we must gather insight from different points that they wrote regarding observance of Torah precepts for Jews, and these in turn imply their opinions about observance of Torah precepts for Gentiles. Therefore, Rambam is the main Torah law authority whose opinion is to be considered in these matters, and therefore his opinion is given more weight than any other single authority. Still, and this is very important, still exceptions can be found, and in the Sheva Mitzvot Hashem, Rabbi Weiner extensively researched and cited the broad spectrum of rabbinical sources. In the few cases where a majority of the other Rishon authorities and the Shulchan Aruch all differ from Rambam, Rabbi Weiner decided the Torah law according to their teachings and not according to the opinion of Rambam. So again, know that as we read through the Mishneh Torah and Rambam's discussion of the Noahide laws, that there are dissenting opinions. I'm not going to go into that at this point. That would make this far too lengthy. I just want to read you the Mishneh Torah, let you at least have an idea for it, and we'll talk a little bit about these kinds of things as we get to that point. So, the question is, what is so special about Maimonides? According to Wikipedia, he was a, quote, Sephardic rabbi and philosopher who became one of the most prolific and influential Torah scholars of the Middle Ages. In his time, he was also a preeminent astronomer and physician, serving as the personal physician of Saladin. He was born and lived in Spain. He was born on Passover Eve, either 1138 or 1135, and he died in 1204. During his lifetime, most Jews greeted Maimonides' writings on Jewish law and ethics with acclaim and gratitude, even as far away as Iraq and Yemen. Yet while Maimonides rose to become the revered head of the Jewish community in Egypt, his writings also had vociferous critics, particularly in Spain. He was posthumously acknowledged as one of the foremost rabbinic decisors and philosophers in Jewish history, and his copious work comprises a cornerstone of Jewish scholarship. His 14-volume Mishneh Torah still carries significant canonical authority as a codification of halacha, or Jewish law. There's a look at the Mishneh Torah in complete volumes here, single volume here, stamp of Maimonides. With Mishneh Torah, Maimonides composed a code of Jewish law with the widest possible scope and depth. The work gathers all the binding laws from the thousands and thousands of pages of Talmud and incorporates the positions of the most relevant commentaries. 14 books in all of the work. The Mishneh Torah made following Jewish law easier for the Jews of his time who were struggling to understand the complex nature of Jewish rules and regulations as they had adapted over the years. Later codes of Jewish law, like the Shulchan Aruch, which would be several hundred years later, by Rabbi Yosef Karo, drew heavily on Mishneh Torah, often quoting whole sections verbatim. However, it met initially with much opposition, still has its critics today. So there were two main points for the opposition. First, Maimonides had refrained from adding references to his work for the sake of brevity. Second, in the introduction, he gave the impression of wanting to cut out the Talmud to arrive at a conclusion in Jewish law, although he disputes that that was his intention. But going back to the first, just again, for those people who are watching this who are Christians and want to have a connection here, it's interesting to note that the criticism that was made on the first sense, that he omitted references for the sake of brevity, kind of goes back to the idea of that Yeshua, Jesus, was criticized for not citing his sources, not talking about acting as if he had his own authority. So Maimonides kind of went through that as well. But again, he certainly had sources, and in many cases, the Torah sources that he had, he did list them, and we'll see that as we get through this. So, in response to those who would attempt to force followers of Maimonides and his Mishneh Torah to abide by the rulings of his own Shulchan Aruch or other later works, Rabbi Yosef Karo, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch, said, quote, "Who would dare force communities who follow the Rambam to follow any other decisor of Jewish law, early or late? The Rambam is the greatest of the decisors, and all the communities of the land of Israel and the Arabia and Northwest Africa practice according to his word and accepted him as their rabbi." So an idea here to remember or think about in terms of the fact that as we read Maimonides, he's the only one that compiled this information for the Noahide. It doesn't exist in this way in any other form. And he did the same thing with Messiah. As we talked about in the Messiah class, the Mishneh Torah, also in Kings and War, is the only place where there's a compilation of everything that the Talmud has to say about the Messiah, the prophecies, who the Messiah should be, who the Messiah shouldn't be. So all of that, again, is exclusively something that Maimonides did, a great achievement and an outstanding work. Is it perfect? Well, we'll see. Many people follow it, and there are, as we talked about, there are critics as well. But we'll go through it, and you can kind of make your own decision as to what you think. So we're going to go now to Sefaria.org, and I want, if you have your laptops here with you or someplace to go to, I'd like you to go here. I want to point out that the Sefaria.org, I know I've mentioned this before, but it is the best place you could possibly go. I would highly recommend that you bookmark the Sefaria.org. So let me show you. Let's go back. I have Mishneh Torah, Kings and Wars here. We're going to start in chapter 8 and go to verse 4. But let's start by taking you back to the home page of Sefaria. So this is, again, Sefaria.org, and this is where this is the landing page, the home page. So, and once you've had done a search, it might show up right here, so you don't have to redo it. But let's start with the search here. Go up to the search button, and you're going to type in Mishneh. Be sure and spell it EH, because AH will get you something different. Mishneh Torah. Okay. And then you always want to choose this icon, because this tells you that it gives you the entire listing of all of the books in it. These are specific books. If you knew where you wanted to go, you could click here. But we're going to click on this one for the Mishneh Torah, and it's now going to take us to the Mishneh Torah and all of the books in it. The book we want, Kings and Laws, is actually all the way to the end. But you see there's one, we said there are 14 books, so we're going to just skip quickly all the way down to where it says Kings and Wars, all the way through the other books. And there's Kings and Wars. Okay, so we're going to click on Kings and Wars. We're going to go to chapter 8. Chapter 8. And then we're going to go to verse, verse 10. And that's where we start the commentary from the Mishneh Torah, on the Noahides. So I'm going to read most of this, and some of it is going to be pretty dry, but I thought about skipping some things that are controversial, but I want you to see them. I don't want you to think I'm trying to hide anything, but this is what he wrote. Remember that Maimonides wrote this in the 12th century. This was a time when under Islam, the Jews fared a lot better than under Christianity. And indeed, that would change, but at this point in time, Maimonides had a much better view of Islam than he did of Christianity, and so that's going to color his writings. But again, I don't apologize for Maimonides, and I don't disbelieve anything that he says. Again, I think that there may be interpretations that, well, we'll talk about that. Anyway, so here's Mishneh Torah, Kings and Wars, chapter 8, verse 10, starting out. And it says that Moses only gave the Torah and mitzvot as an inheritance to Israel. As Deuteronomy 33:4 states, the Torah is the inheritance of the congregation of Yaakov and to all those who desire to convert from among the other nations. As Numbers 15:15 states, the convert shall be the same as you. However, someone who does not desire to accept Torah and mitzvot should not be forced to. Again, Judaism very different from other religions in that we don't teach that the world should be Jewish. We teach that Judaism is a connection, a covenant between God and the children of Abraham. But the rest of the world has their own covenant. At any rate, continuing on. By the same regard, Moses was commanded by the Almighty to compel all of the inhabitants of the world to accept the commandments given to Noah's descendants. If one does not accept these commands, he should be executed. A person who formally accepts these commands is called a resident alien. This applies in any place. This acceptance must be made in the presence of all three Torah scholars. Anyone who agrees to circumcise himself and allows 12 months to pass without circumcising himself is considered as one of the nations. In other words, he didn't do it, so he's not going to do it. So again, very controversial statement here. This does not say that that Judaism believes that we will force the entire world to accept the Noahide commandments. What it simply means is that if you say you want to accept the commandments and you pretend like you've accepted the commandments and then you don't follow them, then you've put yourself under the law, if you will, and there's a penalty for not doing that. Okay. Anyway, continuing on in verse 11. Anyone who accepts upon himself the fulfillment of these 7 mitzvot and is precise in their observance is considered one of the pious among the Gentiles and will merit a share in the world to come. This applies only when he accepts them and fulfills them. And this is, we're also taught this as Jews, that it's one thing to take upon ourselves the Torah and the law. It's another thing to actually do it. And we've committed to both. But he fulfills them because the Holy One, blessed be he, commanded them in the Torah and informed us through Moshe, our teacher, that Noah's descendants had been commanded to fulfill them previously. We'll look at why this is true. We'll take a look at that. We looked at some of that when we looked in the book of Genesis. So we see that these commandments were given prior to Noah as well as after Noah. And we know that that's what Abraham taught. What did Abraham teach? So again, we've talked about all of that before. However, if he fulfills them out of intellectual conviction, he is not a resident alien, nor of the pious among the Gentiles, nor of their wise men. So here's the point that Maimonides is making here. All of the Noahide laws are considered laws that make sense, practical laws of how to live in society, how to get along with one another. So they're all practical. So the point that Maimonides is making here is, if you're just following these things without any connection to Hashem, to God, which is the whole point, is that we're recognizing that these laws were given to us, Gentiles and Jews, to us by God. That's kind of the key point here. It's not because they're a nice thing to do. Again, if you believe that, you believe that, but that's not who the Noahide is in terms of Maimonides, the Mishneh Torah. Going on to chapter 9 then, is where he actually lists the Noahide laws. 6 precepts were commanded to Adam. The prohibition against the worship of false gods, the prohibition against cursing God, the prohibition against murder, the prohibition against incest and adultery, the prohibition against theft, the command to establish laws and courts of justice. Even though we have received all of these commands from Moses, and furthermore they are concepts which intellect itself tends to accept, it appears from the Torah's words that Adam was also commanded from them. And so that's, again, something that we kind of touched on when we dealt with Genesis, but here again he says, the prohibition against eating flesh from a living animal was added for Noah, as Genesis 9:4 states, nevertheless you may not eat flesh with its life, which is its blood. Thus are the 7 mitzvot. The important thing to remember here is the reason that this commandment was never given to Adam is that it's a very clear rabbinic teaching that prior to Noah and the flood, man was forbidden from eating any animal, and were vegetarians. So there's arguments that vegans make about that, but that is only prior to the flood. The commandment is actually given after the flood to eat meat, and there are times when it's actually commanded to eat meat. But that's out of the scope of what we're doing here. So Maimonides goes on to say, these matters remain the same throughout the world until Abraham, When Abraham arose, we talked about this briefly, when Abraham arose, in addition to these, he was commanded regarding circumcision. He also ordained the morning prayers. We didn't talk about that, but he also ordained the morning prayers. Isaac separated tithes and ordained an additional prayer service before sunset. Jacob added the prohibition against eating the sciatic nerve. You can't have, I think it's filet mignon. But anyway, that was because of the wrestling with the angel. And he also, Jacob, also ordained the evening prayers. In Egypt, Amram, father of Moses, was commanded regarding other mitzvot. Ultimately, Moses came and the Torah was completed by him. A Noahide who worships false gods is liable provided he worships them in an accepted manner. This is kind of an important distinction for idolatry for a Noahide. That's why there's some question, there's some belief that Christianity, and again, this is disputed, but there's some discussion about whether or not Christianity is in and of itself idolatry. But at any rate, the idea is that if you worship in an accepted manner, in other words, if worship of a particular statue requires you to kneel before it, and you kneel before it, that's an acceptable manner. If you're just looking at it, this is for the Noahide, not for the Jew. If you're just looking at it, admiring something about it, there's nothing wrong with that for the Noahide. Goes on to say a Noahide is executed for every type of foreign worship which a Jewish court would consider worthy of capital punishment. However, a Noahide is not executed for a type of foreign worship which a Jewish court would not deem worthy of capital punishment. So that's essentially what I just talked about. Nevertheless, even though a Noahide will not be executed for these forms of worship, he is forbidden to engage in all of them. So there's still a forbidden a restriction from doing any form of idolatry, even admiring a statue, but it's not a capital crime. And Maimonides goes on to say we should not allow them to erect a monument, or to plant an Asherah, which is a tree, or to make images and the like, even though they are only for the sake of beauty. Verse 3. A Noahide who curses God's name, whether he uses God's unique name or one of his other names in any language, is liable. And here's what I mentioned earlier. It says this law does not apply with regard to Jews. Again, obviously, a Jew is also forbidden from cursing God's name. But again, one possible explanation is that because there's a different law that the Jew follows, they're not liable to this law. But that's a tough one to decide. So it goes on to say in verse 4, a Noahide who slays any soul, even a fetus, and here we're going to get into some controversy, even a fetus in its mother's womb, should be executed in retribution for its death. Similarly, if he slew a person who would have otherwise died in the near future, placed a person before a lion, or starved a person to death, he should be executed for, through one manner or other, he killed the person. Similarly, one should be executed if he killed a pursuer when he could have saved the latter's potential victim by maiming one of the pursuer's limbs. These laws do not apply with regards to Jews. Of course they do. But again, the point here is if you can stop a pursuer from harming you without taking his or her life, then that's the desired way to deal with it. Now we're talking about adultery and incest and laws of purity, essentially. So there are 6 illicit sexual relations forbidden to a Noahide. This is actually less than, again, I don't want to go into the time of comparing, but just to let you know, there are additional ones listed in the Torah for Israel. But the 6 listed here: his mother, his father's wife, a married woman, his maternal sister, a male, and an animal. These prohibitions derive from the verse in Genesis 2:24. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and cling to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So, according to Maimonides, the explanation from that verse is his father alludes to his father's wife. His mother is to be understood simply. Cling to his wife and not his colleague's wife. His wife and not a male. They shall become one flesh. This excludes domesticated animals, beasts, or fowl, for man can never become one flesh with them. This prohibition against relations with a maternal sister is derived from the verse Genesis 20:13 that says, "She is my sister, my father's daughter, but not my mother's. Thus she became my wife." So we see an exception, since we see the example of it in Noah. Again, not true for Jews, but for Noahides, there is supposedly or possibly an exception there. Going on to verse 6. And this kind of goes, I don't know if I want to spend a lot, this is just details, a lot more details about this. So Noahide is liable for relation with his mother, and it gives all the details of where he should be liable. Relations with a male, whether a minor or an adult, with an animal, whether young or old. In the latter instance, the Noahide alone is executed, not the animal. We are only commanded to kill an animal with a Jew engaged in such relations. A Noahide, verse 7, a Noahide is not executed for adultery with his colleague's wife. Now, this is a little convoluted, but the main point here is that if there is an uncertainty, ignorance of the law in a way, I suppose, although later on he'll say that's no excuse, but there's some slight difference here between the law for a Noahide and the law for a Jew. And the Gentile who engages in relations with a Jewish maiden who has been consecrated is stoned to death because of her, as is the law regarding Jews. So we just have that idea of being a part of that. Verse 8, a Noahide who singles out one of his maidservants or one of his slaves and afterwards engages in relations with her is executed because the violation prohibition against adultery. She's been promised, so this kind of again goes against the idea of you not to take in the Middle Ages especially. There was an idea of when a woman is betrothed or newly married, the king has the right to have first visit with her. That, of course, is forbidden. Again, these laws all make sense for living in a peaceful and organized, non-chaotic society. So going on to verse 9, a Noahide is liable for violating the prohibition against theft, whether he stole from another Gentile or from a Jew. This applies to one who forcefully robs an individual or steals money, a kidnapper, an employer who withholds his workers' wages, and the like. Even a worker who eats from his employer's produce when he is not working. In all such cases, he's liable and is considered as a robber. With regards to Jews, the law is different. Again, it's harsher than this. Similarly, a Noahide is liable for stealing an object worth less than a peruta. Thus, if a Noahide stole an object worth less than a peruta and another Noahide stole it from him, they are both executed. This is a very low sum, and I apologize, I don't know exactly what it is, but you can certainly Google it. But the idea is that it has to be pretty much worthless in order for it not to count as stealing. 10, similarly, a Noahide is liable for violating the prohibition against eating a limb or flesh from a living creature. This applies regardless of the amount involved. The specification of minimum amounts only applies to Jews. A Noahide is permitted blood from a living creature, although again there's some discussion about that. And when we take a look at Acts and the Christian church, we're going to see that that is definitely forbidden. The prohibition applies to a limb or flesh that is separated from either a domesticated animal or a beast. However, it appears to me that the Noahide is not exceeded or is executed for eating a limb. And then he goes on again, more details about the slaughtering of animals and about prohibitions applying to a Jew regarding a limb versus a Noahide. Similarly, a Noahide is forbidden to partake of a limb from a living creature. Again, all of this has to do with non-cruelty to animals and other living beings. In verse 14, it says, "How must the Noahides fulfill the commandment to establish laws and courts? They are obligated to set up judges and magistrates in every major city to render judgment concerning these 6 mitzvot and to admonish the people regarding their observance. A Noahide who transgresses these 7 commands shall be executed by decapitation. For this reason, all the inhabitants of Shechem were obligated to die. Shechem kidnapped. They observed and were aware of his deeds, but did not judge him. A Noahide is executed on the basis of the testimony of one witness and the verdict of a single judge. No warning is required. Relatives may serve as a witness. However, a woman may not serve as a witness or judge for them." So this is, again, very different than it's less stringent than the laws for Jews in the same manner. But the other thing to mention here is that the Noahides, although there are times if you're living in Israel, then you're under Israeli law, and that's the difference here. But if you're not living in Israel, the Noahides are obligated to set up their own laws. So again, Judaism teaches that you are obligated, Jews as well as Gentiles, are obligated to the laws of their land, because this is the biblical commandment that every land sets up its own laws. Now, where those laws transgress Torah commandments, then there's an issue. But essentially, we are obligated to obey the law of the land. So in chapter 10, the last chapter dealing with the Noahides that we'll be taking a look at, it says, "A Noahide who inadvertently violates one of his commandments is exempt from all punishment with the exception of a person who kills inadvertently. In such an instance, the redeemer of the blood is not executed for slaying the killer, nor may the latter seek asylum in a city of refuge. However, the court will not execute him." So, strange verse, strange section. And again, this only applies in the land of Israel and under Sanhedrin law. But what this is saying is that executions for inadvertently killing someone cannot be done by the court, but if a relative of that person slays them, and this, of course, is very different from the law of our land, so be very careful in this. If a relative slays him, that relative is not liable for any punishment. So when does the above apply? When he inadvertently violates a command without sinful intention. For example, a person who engages in relation with his colleague's wife under the impression that she is his own wife or unmarried. Again, kind of a strange one. If, however, one knew that she was his colleague's wife but did not know that she was forbidden to him, again, all of this is kind of strange, then the act was permitted, or one killed without knowing that it's forbidden to kill, he's considered close to having sinned. Actually, let me start this again because this is a little different. If, however, one knew that she was his colleague's wife but did not know that she was forbidden to him, or it occurred to him that this act was permitted, or one killed without knowing that it's forbidden to kill, he is considered close to having sinned intentionally and is executed. This is the idea of ignorance of the law is no excuse, very clearly laid out here by Maimonides. Verse 2, a Noahide who is forced by another person to violate one of his commandments is permitted to transgress, even if he's forced to worship false gods, which for a Jew, there are three things that we're not allowed to, that we are required to give our life for, but everything else we don't have to. So anyway, for Noahides are not commanded to sanctify God's name. A Noahide minor, a deaf mute, or a fool is never given punishment, for they are not bound by any commandments. This again is the idea of insanity, the insanity defense that is used in modern times, kind of takes itself from here. A Noahide who converted, was circumcised, and immersed in the mikveh, and afterwards decided to forsake God. So in other words, a Noahide decides to convert, to become a Jew. And then later forsakes God, reverts to his previous status as a resident alien. He is not granted permission to do so. You can't just change your mind. That's why it's so difficult to do a real conversion, an Orthodox conversion, because you're dissuaded as much as possible. Because once you make that choice, once you make that decision is final as far as Judaism is concerned. So rather, he must remain as an Israelite in all matters or be executed. If he was a minor and immersed by the court, immersed in the mikveh, he may repudiate his conversion when he attains majority and assume the status of a resident alien alone. However, if he does not object as soon as he attains majority, he is no longer given the opportunity to object, and his status is that of a righteous convert. Therefore, if a Jew has relations with a girl below the age of majority who was immersed in the mikveh by a court, the money due her as payment of her ketubah or as a fine for raping her or seducing her is placed in the custody of the court. And there's, again, very complicated situations here. Verse 4 says, a Noahide who converts after cursing God's name, worshiping false gods, engaging in relations forbidden, or killing a fellow Noahide is exempt from punishment. The idea that conversion, Judaism also teaches marriage, does the same thing. You have a new life, you begin again. Again, this is Jewish law. It goes against the law of the land. We follow the law of the land. In contrast, if he converted after killing a Jew or having relation to the Jew's wife, he is liable. So we have some distinction there. Number 5, verse 5. It has already been explained the Noahides are always executed by decapitation, except in cases when one engages in relations with the wife of a Jew or a consecrated maiden. In the latter instance, he is stoned to death. If he engaged in relations with a Jew's wife after they were married, etc., so there's different capital punishments for these things. It's forbidden for a Noahide to crossbreed an animal or graft different species of trees together. We kind of talked about that in terms of the idea of grafting onto the tree of Abraham. However, they are not executed for violating this. Verse 7, only Abraham and his descendants were commanded regarding circumcision. As Genesis 17:9-10 states, keep my covenant, you and your offspring circumcise every male. So and then there's some discussion as to whether this applies to the descendants of Ishmael, and ultimately there is an obligation there as well. It's not quite as strong as the obligation of the descendants of Isaac as opposed to just Abraham. But some discussion of that. Verse 8, our sages related that the descendants of Keturah, or the offspring of Abraham that came after Isaac and Ishmael, are also obligated in circumcision. An explanation there. Going on to verse 9, a Gentile who studies the Torah, and this is another very controversial one. A Gentile who studies the Torah is obligated to die. They should only be involved in the study of their 7 mitzvot. There's definitely discussion about this and not agreement with it in every case, in many cases. Similarly, a Gentile who rests, even on a weekday, observing that day as a Sabbath, is obligated to die. Needless to say, he is obligated for that punishment if he creates a festival for himself. The general principle governing these matters is Gentiles, they are not to be allowed to originate a new religion or create mitzvot for themselves based on their own decisions. They may either become righteous converts and accept all the mitzvot or retain their statutes within adding or detracting from them. Again, the main point here is that this is in the land of Israel when the Sanhedrin is in session. At least that's one of the arguments. If a Gentile studies the Torah, makes a Sabbath, or creates a religious practice, a Jewish court should beat him, punish him, and inform him that he is obligated to die. However, he is not to be executed. Verse 10, we should not prevent a Noahide who desires to perform one of the Torah's mitzvot in order to receive a reward from doing so, provided he performs it as required. So again, you don't have to convert, you don't have to become a Jew in order to do good deeds, but if you're doing good deeds and claiming them to be in the name of the laws of Torah, then they have to be done as it's required. If a Noahide who observes the 7 mitzvot gives charity, we should accept it from him. It appears to me it should be given to the Jewish poor, for the Noahide may derive sustenance from the Jews, and they are commanded to support him if necessary. In contrast, if an idolater gives charity, we should accept it from him and give it to the Gentile poor. So again, a way to distribute money, charity, where it should go. Verse 11, the Jewish court is obligated to appoint judges for these resident aliens, to judge them according to these statutes, so the world will not become decadent. If the court sees fit to appoint the judges from the resident aliens themselves, they may. If it sees fit to appoint them from among the Jews, they may. And again, mostly dealing in the land of Israel, but obviously it also has to do with what he mentioned earlier, that every Gentile in their own land is required to set up their own courts. Should 2 idolaters come before you to have their dispute judged according to Jewish law, if they both desire to be judged according to Torah law, they should be judged accordingly. If one desires to be judged according to Torah law and the other does not, they are only forced to be judged according to their own laws. So, goes on to describe that. Similarly, it appears to me that in regard to respect and honor also, in regard to charity, a resident alien is to be treated as a Jew, for behold, we are commanded to sustain them. As Deuteronomy 14:21 states, you may not eat any animal that has not been properly slaughtered. Give it to the resident alien in your gates that he may eat it. Though our sages counseled against repeating a greeting to them, that statement applies to idolaters and not resident aliens. So there's a definite distinction made between the ger toshav and Gentile idolaters. However, our sages commanded us to visit the Gentiles when ill, to bury their dead in addition to the Jewish dead, and support their poor in addition to the Jewish poor for the sake of peace. Behold, Psalms 145:9 states, God is good to all, and his mercies extend over all his works. And Proverbs 3:17 states, the Torah's ways are pleasant, and all its paths are peace. So there we have the ideas from Mishnah. We're going to stop there. That's the last chapter that pretty much deals with the Noahide commandments. Again, some controversial things there, some things that you may disagree with, but I wanted to give you that basic picture. Now, in the next class, we're going to take a look at what the book of Acts and another book called the Didache, and we'll talk more about that. It has to do with and we'll talk a little bit about early Christian history and give you some ideas there to prove for those Christians that might argue, well, this is a Jewish thing, it's not a Christian thing. That's very much not true. It is a Jewish thing, but it was also a Christian thing, and especially considering that Christianity was, of course, Jewish in its beginning times. Only after Constantine did that change. Anyway, we'll deal with all of that in the next class. So thank you for joining me for this second class for the Intro to the Noahide Laws on Yeshiva B'nai Noach. I'm Tom Averna. Thanks for being a part of this.